Hello and welcome back to my immunology videos. So let me just label these for us real quick. I hope you guys can see these. E, F, G, A, B, C, E, F, and G. We're going to be taking a look at Ouchterlony assays today, okay? Now, Ouchterlony assays is an immunodiffusion technique that allows for immunologists to determine the relations between the same pathogen or whether the pathogens on a petri dish are actually present on the petri dish. So how does this work? Well, you have an antibody in the middle of this petri dish. And via diffusion, usually using agarose so it doesn't diffuse too rapidly, it will diffuse upwards towards the antigen. So it will diffuse towards the antigens in question, just like this. And as it reaches the antigen in question, if it has bind specificity towards that antigen, it will form precipitate. Now, for example, our petri dish had H1N1 and SARS-CoV-2. So, as this antibody reach each of these wells, precipitate would only form for either H1N1 or SARS-CoV-2, depending on what antibody we use. If we used an antibody that didn't have bind specificity towards either of those antigens, then we would have a problem and this lab would be useless. And we would know that H1N1 or SARS-CoV-2 was not present on the dish. However, we know that our antibody utilized in the lab had bind specificity towards SARS-CoV-2. Now, this bind specificity will only form precipitate in the wells that contain SARS-CoV-2. So, for example, with this being said, we know that A has COVID, B has COVID, and C has COVID. And we know that E, F, and G have H1N1 or another pathogen in question. But most likely, since we only had H1N1 and SARS-CoV-2, we can determine it's just H1N1. But with that being said, now that we know what wells actually have SARS-CoV-2, we can determine the relatedness between all of the SARS-CoV-2 on here. So we can determine if it's the same strain, a partially related strain, or a non-identical strain whatsoever, meaning the strains are completely different. They share no similarities. They're just the same type of pathogen. So basically that would just determine that they're SARS-CoV-2. So with that being said, you have to look at the patterns of the precipitate formed. Now, as you can see, we have a pattern that formed here, a pattern that formed here, patterns that formed here. And when you look at patterns in an Ouchterlony assay, full identity looks like this. And that means that they are fully related to one another. They are identical strains. Partial identity has one spur. And that means that they are not identical strains. However, they do share some of the same DNA, some of the same genetics. They are partially related to one another. Non-identity means, yes, they are the same pathogen in question. They're both SARS-CoV-2, but they share no similar DNA. They share similar DNA, but they don't share similar DNA in the sense that we actually care. And that would be non-identical. So by analyzing our patterns here, we know that A and B, since they form this perfectly linear pattern, are identical strains. So they might be, say, the delta strain. Let's say A and B equal delta, like the airlines. C, however, as you can see, C, however, as you can see, did not form that perfect line with B. However, it didn't form a crisscross either. It just kind of formed a precipitate. And what this kind of means that if you do draw this line, it was trying to reach the B, but it couldn't reach the B. However, there would still be a spur that forms here. So that means they are partially related to one another. So B to C equals partial. Now, the tricky thing to keep in mind, and this is when conceptual reasoning comes into play, is if you want to determine the relatedness from C to A, you really can't, because we didn't put C side by side with A on any of these petri dishes. However, since we know that A and B are identical strains, we can reason that since C is partial identity to B, it would also be partial identity to A, since B and A are identical strains. So that means A and C are also partial. And once again, we have no non-identicals on here. We can also, once again, eliminate F, E, and G as H1N1 because no precipitate formed. But I hope this video helped, and I hope you guys have a wonderful night.